Soldier Mage King, Chapter 26, The Once and Future Queen, Part 1. Arthur was beyond angry, though perhaps frustrated was a better word for it. He was being lied to by one of his closest companions. Sir Leon was letting him win. How was he supposed to know and expand on his own limits if he wasn't actually challenged? So he'd come up with a plan. A bit last minute, he'd admit, but he was glad to have Merlin and Gwen supporting him, or it would never have worked. He would enter the tournament in disguise, win, and reveal himself to prove that he really was the best at what he did. Merlin was, as ever, exasperated with him, though she thought this was a spectacularly bad idea, but when he'd insisted, had convinced Gwen to let them borrow her house in the lower town. Their claim was that since the last time there had been a tournament, her father had been alive, she was feeling lonely, and Morgana was more than happy to have Gwen staying in her antechamber. He gave her someone to talk to when her nightmares became too much. "You're late," Arthur called as the door to the small house opened. He needed to be changed and in the tent before the sun rose, and everyone else made it to the tourney grounds. I know, Merlin called back, setting down the bag with his armor in it on the table. "What kept you? It's not like you have anything else to do since I'm not supposed to be in Camelot." Arthur needled and Merlin stiffened. "You're kidding, right?" she asked, her tone going icy. Arthur blinked. "What do you think I do when you're not around? Sit and wait for more orders?" He opened his mouth, but she didn't seem to actually want answers to her questions. "I haven't had a moment to rest since I got to Camelot. I am constantly running around after you, and on the rare occasions when that is not the case, I'm trailing after Gaius, making potions for him, cleaning up after him, or studying remedies from him. I am supposed to be cleaning his leech tank right at this moment because you're not in Camelot," she snapped. Arthur blinked. He didn't remember the last time someone other than his father had actually raised their voice at him. Even Merlin's usual snips were at a reasonable volume, but she was well and truly yelling now. "You are such an ass, Arthur Pendragon." He winced at the use of his full name. Merlin never called him that. To her, he was just Arthur. "You don't seem to realize that the whole of creation does not, in fact, center on you." She turned and stormed out before he even had a chance to reply. A few minutes later, Gwen entered looking sheepish. Arthur flushed slightly. "How much of that did you hear?" Arthur asked, and Gwen's look turned downward. "Just the last sentence," she admitted, pulling the armor Merlin had brought, polished to a near mirror shine, out of the bag. Arthur frowned. "She has a point," Gwen pointed out, handing him his chainmail to slip into. She helped him with his armor and frowned. "Why are you doing this, sire?" It was day into the tournament, and she hadn't thought to ask before now. "People only respect me for my title." "That's not true of everyone. Merlin, for example." "I don't think Merlin's got a respectful bone in her body," Arthur said, picking up the helmet that hid his identity from the crowd. "Completely untrue. She just doesn't think of life the way we do. She wasn't raised in a court setting, even as a servant. Where she's from, actions are what matters. And as much as she may deny it, she cares about you. You should have seen her when you were wounded from the questing beast. She didn't sleep, and the minute there was a possible cure, she went after it without a second thought. And that care was never because you're the prince, just because you're Arthur. Maybe think about that before you speak to her again," Gwen advised, nodding to the door. Arthur couldn't get Gwen's words out of his head, especially when the tall, handsome stranger approached Merlin, who had yet to speak to him again that day, but was paying attention to his horse. Gwen frowned as she slipped into the tent. "How do I make this up to Merlin?" he asked, carefully glancing out of the tent. Merlin was now speaking to Gaius, who was frowning. Arthur dropped the tent flap before the physician could see him. "That's a difficult question, but maybe doing something nice for her? Like make her dinner," Gwen suggested. Arthur frowned. I don't know how to do that," Arthur quietly admitted. "I can help with that," Gwen said with a smile. Merlin frowned as she rolled one of Arthur's shirts up under her arm. She'd only had one spare, slightly damaged from the time Lancelot had been injured and saved her. She needed to apologize for what she'd done in yelling at him, but she really didn't want to. Gwen had asked her to bring down a few more shirts. She suspected it was because she wanted them to talk it out. Slipping on her cloak and slipping out was easy. Gaius was caring for a young mother in the lower town. She was still a few months out from having her baby. She was just getting a routine checkup. She slipped out of the castle without alerting anyone and made her way to Gwen's door. Pausing, she knocked. After a moment, she entered and raised an eyebrow. Arthur was setting down a plate on the table across from what Merlin assumed was his own. "What are you doing?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Making an effort. I made you dinner," Arthur said, and Merlin's eyebrow climbed. "You made dinner? Who actually made it? Because I don't feel like getting poisoned again," Merlin asked, and Arthur huffed. "Despite what you may believe, I am capable of some things, Merlin," Arthur said, but her eyebrow reminded him too much of Gaius for him to continue the lie. "Gwen told me what to do. I did it. So yes, I cooked. Gwen supervised," Arthur admitted, running a hand through his hair. Merlin laughed. "You were right. I should be more conscious of the people around me, starting with you." Merlin set down a bundle of clothes on the table, and Arthur recognized a few of his shirts. "You brought that for me?" "Thought you might be more comfortable," she said, shrugging. Neither of them came forward to say the word sorry, but the air around them seemed to shift, and Merlin laughed, breaking the tension. Arthur grinned, and they both sat down. As dinners went, it was one of the most pleasant Arthur had ever experienced. There was no stilted silence from his father or smug, sarcastic looks from Morgana. When both plates were cleared, Merlin laughed as he offered to do the dishes while she walked home. "You? Cleaning? That's not something I'm going to miss, thank you very much," she teased. When he proved somewhat hopeless, she stood from the bench and reached around him to show him what to do. He turned, and suddenly they were very much in each other's space. She was barely a breath away from him, this time without his armor between them. The small brush Gwen used to wash her dishes slipped through Merlin's fingers, but neither of them seemed to notice. Arthur reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair behind Merlin's ear. They were bigger than he'd thought they would be up close, usually hidden by her hair or her scarf when she used it to pull back her hair. It was endearing. Tonight, though, she'd left her hair down, not up in her usual practical braid. He wondered what it would feel like between his fingers. The door banged open and they sprung apart. "King Odin sent an assassin after Arthur," Gwen panted. The Once and Future Queen, Part 2. "Why would Odin send an assassin after you?" Merlin asked. The mood had been shattered by Gwen's intrusion and the news of a deadly assassin in Camelot. "Because I killed his son," Arthur said, staring down at his hands. "He challenged me to single combat. I had no quarrel with him, but he wouldn't withdraw. He challenged to the death. I think he thought he had to prove something," Arthur said, staring down at his hands, which were shaking. "He looked so scared." "But no one knows you're here. The assassin can't kill you if he doesn't know you're here," Merlin pointed out, reaching out so her hand gently rested on Arthur's shoulder. His hand slid up to hers, and Gwen hid a smile behind her hand. She'd never seen Arthur calm so quickly as he did around Merlin. "Will you drop out of the tournament?" Gwen asked. Arthur shook his head. "I've never dropped out of a fight before, and no one knows I'm Sir William anyway," Arthur reasoned. "Still, someone should stay here with you tonight, just in case," Merlin said, sitting down on the bench next to Arthur. He shook his head. "Merlin, there's only one bed." "I've slept on the floor for most of my life, Arthur, and honestly, I don't know if I'll be sleeping much tonight, but if you insist on jousting tomorrow, then you need to," Merlin insisted. Gwen nodded. Her task finished, she returned to the castle. On her way to Morgana's chambers, she ran into Gaius. "Ah, Gwen, have you seen Merlin? I can't seem to find her," the physician asked. Gwen frowned. No. I'm sure she'll turn up. She's probably fine," Gaius raised an eyebrow, but let Gwen slide past him in the hall. The next morning, Merlin helped Arthur pull on his armor. The next morning, Merlin helped Arthur into his armor. After a moment, she pulled off her scarf and held it out to him. "For luck," she said, going pink at the ears. Arthur grinned and offered his arm. She tied the fabric there, and they left for the tourney field. Arthur's reasoning for continuing the tournament despite the threat of an assassin was solid enough. No one knew he was even in Camelot. But something was off. He only realized it as the tipped lance pierced his side. He rode a second bout and got lucky. The girth on the other man's saddle snapped, letting Arthur send his lance right into his chest for a clean shot, toppling him back off his horse. He fell still, and Arthur managed to make it to the end of the lists, throwing down his lance. He nearly toppled off his horse, only to be caught by a pair of familiar hands. Merlin somehow got him into the tent. For once, Merlin didn't feel too bad that she'd helped kill someone. The assassin had been after Arthur, and would have killed him just for a price. Arthur was bleeding, though, as she got him into the tent. Their false Sir William helped her get his armor off as Gwen ran into the tent. "Go to Sir Alinor's tent. Gaius will be there. Bring him here. I'll explain everything to him, but I need his kit. Arthur's going to need stitches," Merlin instructed her. Gwen ran off and returned a moment later with Gaius, whose eyes widened at the sight of Arthur, Merlin's hands covered in his blood as she applied pressure to the wound. "I take it the assassin found out about this ruse," Gaius said, pulling open his kit. Merlin nodded. "I fear that may have been my fault. Everyone knows I'm always around Arthur," Merlin said, and Arthur's hand found her arm. "This is in no way your fault," she said, and Merlin smiled at him. It was then that Gaius noticed the scarf knotted around Arthur's arm. Between the two of them, they managed to get Arthur stitched up. Gaius went to inform the crowd that their champion was all right. "Well, now's the moment," Merlin said, washing her hands in a bowl of water. Arthur looked at her and shook his head. "You must go collect the trophy," he said to their false Sir William. "Sire?" "Go on," Arthur insisted. "I thought this was your moment of triumph," Merlin said, grinning. Arthur winced, pulling on his cloak. "Well, someone did remind me that the world does not, in fact, center on me," he teased, and Merlin laughed, helping him outside so they could watch the crowd cheer their hero. She helped Arthur outside the city and left him in the care of the returned patrol. She had to scurry back to Gaius to explain what had really been happening for the past few days. He was not pleased he'd been left out. Hours later, she was scrubbing the leech tank as a reminder to not lie to her guardian when the door opened. Merlin pulled herself out of the tank and frowned. Sir Leon was standing in the doorway. "Merlin, you've got..." He motioned to her cheek. Merlin mercilessly yanked the leech off of her cheek. "Why are you here, Sir Leon?" she asked, wiping a bit of blood off of her face. "Someone asked me to deliver something," Leon said before holding out a bouquet of flowers wrapped in Merlin's scarf, the one she'd given Arthur as a favor. Merlin went bright pink as she stood and took the flowers from Leon. He nodded and leaned closer. "No one will ever hear of it from me," he assured before leaving her alone in the room. Merlin stared down at the flowers in her arms and couldn't help the grin on her face as she headed up to her room to find something to put them in.